Good to see you again on our channel. The band was at the height of its fame in the 1960s, when their music would live on forever, but by the decade's conclusion, things had started to go south for the group. Rumors circulated for a long time about what exactly led to this breakup. Yoko Ono, the wife of John Lennon, has had a particularly negative impact on legendary bassist Paul McCartney, who has been open about his displeasure with her in the past. She has become a media scapegoat as many of her fans in the studio held her responsible for the breakup. Although, according to McCartney's recent contemplations, there is more nuance to it than that. The band may have broken up for a variety of reasons. Therefore, let's examine those causes in detail, as well as McCartney's changing feelings about Ono. Read on for an in-depth look at the real events surrounding the Beatles' breakup and their subsequent reconciliation, culled from a collection of interviews conducted over 5 decades. It was expected that the Grammy winner would initially be frustrated with Ono. Paul McCartney and John Lennon, the band's motors, had a falling out due in large part to the friction that Lennon's new creative pursuits and his personal ties to Ono caused. Ono was reportedly present for a significant portion of the studio time spent making the White Album, according to McCartney. No one in the band was opposed to this, but they weren't completely enthusiastic either. Tensions were rising in the job, and the bassist had hinted at them by calling Ono an interference. It had to have been quite the uncomfortable circumstance. It was clear that John Lennon's priorities were changing when he insisted on having his wife on site. Ono wasn't merely a bystander. She actively impacted Lennon's creative process, which is rather interesting. According to others, it likely caused McCartney and the others to feel marginalized, which in turn strained group chemistry and made recording more difficult. For sure, everyone involved was irritated by the scenario, but they remained silent in order to boost production and prevent any potential conflicts. They did it, says McCartney, because it was necessary. Their mission was done and could not be negotiated. His podcast, McCartney, A Life in Lyrics, has delved at Ono's function within the band. A change in group dynamics was inevitable, he says, after the pair got together. Some things were out of your control, like Yoko's sudden appearance in the midst of the recording session. John should have his way if he wants this to happen, he said. It seems to make perfect sense. Being the first to depart from the organization, Lennon's actions did not help matters. Although the public didn't find out about this until much later, Paul McCartney was originally supposed to shoulder the group's blame. His wrath must have been intensified by it. Nevertheless, this is hardly the final chapter. Paul McCartney's opinion on Ono changed over time, which is a stunning development. It was an oversimplification, McCartney said in an interview given decades after the separation, to say that Ono was to blame for the Beatles' breakup. He cleared Yoko Ono of guilt and may have put an end to the controversy surrounding his apparent conflict with John Lennon's widow when he revealed that the band was already in a precarious position, nearing the end of their trip, before Ono even joined. Assuming that Ono is the only one responsible for the breakup is unfair and incorrect. Importantly, by changing the storyline, McCartney freed the widow from the decades-long animosity she had endured at the hands of the band's most ardent supporters. In her own words, Ono likens the way her followers have treated her to being falsely accused of murder. It must have been so much easier for her to just forget about it. According to McCartney, the two were a formidable combination and would make a fantastic couple. It would be unfair to pin the breakup on a single cause because there was a complicated interplay of factors. So, why did the Beatles decide to split up? The dissolution of one of the most groundbreaking bands in music history may have had more subtle causes, but let's take a look at what else could have contributed to the breakup. The blame shouldn't lie just with one woman. There were a number of factors at play, such as conflicts over artistic priorities and individual ambitions. There were a lot of divergences in their creative vision by the late 60s. As artists, the Beatles had all been developing their own unique styles. As a result of Ono's influence, Lennon dove headfirst into avant-garde art and musical experimentation. Alternatively, McCartney was inclining toward more conventional pop tunes. Two artists who had collaborated for years were even more tense as a result of this distance. It was only reasonable to place the blame on the newcomer as the cause of the distance. Constantly speculated that the group's disintegration might be hastened by the difficulty in cooperating due to this individualism. It seemed inevitable that the four distinct but powerful personalities inside a single band would eventually break up, as McCartney pondered. The fact that the Beatles' meteoric climb to stardom came at such a cost is another potential consideration. The strain they were under was through the sky. The group devoted themselves entirely to recording by the late 1960s, when they had ceased traveling. Although they may have recorded some of their most famous albums during that time, the band's internal strife became apparent at that same time. The band members were becoming frustrated working solely on set since they hadn't been on tour in a while. The change in management was one of many interconnected factors that led to the band's dissolution. Alan Klein, their most recent manager, was the target of McCartney's wrath and anger. Brian Epstein's D, the band's former manager, passed away in 1967, leaving the band to fend for itself without his direction. The new manager and McCartney had a tense relationship. The bassist says that he planned to sue the new manager, Klein, to prevent him from handling the band's money, but ultimately decided against it. Following that, McCartney paused for a while. In the midst of his seclusion in Scotland, McCartney's mental health suffered. After losing the Beatles and going through all those legal challenges, he started to doubt his future and his place in music history. In interviews, he has discussed his struggles with alcoholism and the feelings of loss and uncertainty that accompanied his struggles to find purpose in his everyday life. Paul McCartney didn't rediscover his life's calling until his wife Linda urged him to compose music again, even though it was a difficult time for him. This period set the stage for his solo career and the creation of Wings. Still, McCartney spent years in the shadow of the Beatles, which prompted him to ponder on the past in his interview and ultimately forgive and exonerate Ono, despite his newfound success. The breakup of the Beatles was probably inevitable given the new dynamic and the growing conflicts within the band. Even though the breakup was the most difficult time of his life, McCartney could still see the subtlety in these things when he reflected on the past. However, unlike what was previously believed, Ono was not the villain in the Beatles' story. The Beatles' breakup was the product of a chain reaction of tensions, shifts, and individual developments that, looking back, seemed almost inevitable. Changes in their creative dynamic were a major factor. Lennon and McCartney's once harmonious songwriting connection started to fall apart as the years went by. Although they were both extremely talented musicians, John and Paul began to have different ideas about the future of the band. McCartney preferred organized recording sessions and polished, melodic pop in an effort to keep the band's core intact, while Lennon, who was becoming more and more impacted by his private life and Yoko Ono, pushed toward more experimental, raw, and avant-garde sounds. A once harmonious collaboration turned into an unhealthy rivalry as each side pushed their own agenda, widening the gap between them with each new recording. George Harrison was not the only one who had complaints. Harrison felt his songwriting had reached a level of maturity by the late 1960s when he thought his contributions were worthy of equal recognition. But the Lennon-McCartney juggernaut was always bigger and better than him. Unquestionably, masterpieces were songs like Something and Here Comes the Sun. But Harrison's dissatisfaction mounted as he saw his creative input ignored in decisions regarding the band's future course of action. An additional example of the ingrained animosity is when Harrison once left a recording session. But Lennon's changing relationship with Yoko Ono was probably the hardest hit personally. Despite many accusations that Ono was responsible for the band's disbandment, the truth is much more nuanced. The connection between Lennon and Ono was profound, and she played a significant role in his artistic and psychological development. The other members of the band were already on edge because she was there when they recorded something completely new. It wasn't so much Ono as she stood for Lennon's rising yearning for autonomy, for a life and a sound apart from the Beatles, that was important. The unity that had previously characterized the Beatles dissipated as Lennon's dedication to the band diminished. Their breakup seemed inevitable given the demands of celebrity, the significance of their legacy, and the ups and downs of their individual lives. In hindsight, it's clear that the Beatles had outgrown themselves. After all, each member had their own personal goals, aspirations, and creative demands. While the dissolution was painful for their legions of admirers, the four members saw it as a natural progression in their careers. The breakup of the Beatles was devastating for everyone involved, including McCartney, but it gave the band members a chance to shine individually, rather than being defined by the legacy of the greatest band of all time. Then, what are your thoughts on McCartney's stance on Yoko Ono? When you consider all of this, what do you believe the true cause was for the breakup of a very remarkable group? Do you think Ono was rightfully treated after the band's breakup? And do you think she contributed to the band's breakup? Leave a comment telling us what you think. We're really interested. Much obliged for your time.